Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage, on a beautiful Sunday morning in the state of Maine. Somewhere in the 60-degree temperature range. The sun is out, there's a little breeze. Can't beat early September 2024. So, today's comparison is between the TH350, which has been around almost as long as the Turbo 400, which is the standard strength-wise of all General Motors automatic transmissions. It was and is still the pinnacle of strength and performance, the Turbo 400. And a lot of that's by design, so what's the difference? Well, as you can see in the thumbnail picture, it's possible to build an aftermarket, that's an ATI super cased Turbo 350. I haven't had it apart yet, that's next. It's brand new. I'm curious to find what's inside and kind of I guess we'll have to do a follow-up video, were some of the areas that I feel are weaknesses, were they improved? I know several people, and I'm sure you do too, that their cousin's uncle's brother's aunt's cousin ran a Turbo 350 in a top fuel car and it held up just fine. That has never been my findings. So, see, Turbo 350 has its place. I believe that's in a mild street car, street rod, something like that. It's pretty compact, same footprint as the Power Glide and the 4-speed transmissions, 3-speed and 4-speed transmissions. It will bolt in a 6-inch, the shortest one they came in. The Turbo 350 came in 6, 9, and 12-inch two-wheel drive output shaft lengths. And then at least three 4-wheel drive output shaft lengths, which is why I have to take this transmission apart to harvest the output shaft for the expensive one you saw in the thumbnail. Over the years, I've seen many Turbo 350s explode, both on video and in person. If you're anywhere near a chassis dyno or anything, don't get near it, because when the Turbo 350 fails, it usually cuts the case in half, and you'll find it flipped upside down under the floorboards. The pan will be up against the floorboard and the top of the case looking at the ground. It will shear the case right off. And I think I have a pretty good idea why. But first, let's look at a few obvious things. This is going to be a somewhat non-technical look at them, but here's a Turbo 350 input shaft. It's very long, it's very thin compared to the stouter, shorter Turbo 400. Which is thicker and shorter. So in theory, it's always going to be stronger. As far as function goes, between the Turbo 350 and the Turbo 400, they both have 3 speeds, similar amount of clutches, and 2 one-way clutches, Sprags or roller, depending on what type, I suppose. So construction-wise, for today's argument anyway, they're very similar, so we'll call that a wash. In production, again, the Turbo 350 came out a few years after the Turbo 400. They have always used all 8 pump bolts. In a Turbo 400, you've heard me talk about it, there's 6 bolt, 7, and 8 bolt options, depending on how the case was made. As far as I know, the Turbo 350 always used all 8 bolts. And it takes the same aftermarket bell housing as the Turbo 400, same part number, same gasket, O-ring. Very similar as far as attaching that. I find it, I don't know why the Turbo 400 made the change down the road. I'm sure it was to save a few pennies, but between the hard parts, the Turbo 350 has more Torrington bearings than the Turbo 400. And as far as I know, always did, all the way up through. Say Turbo 350 became TH350C, which was a lockup torque converter, something the Turbo 400 never got. And I'm okay with that, but you know, in theory, that's when they started to worry about fuel economy. One of the many times they made an attempt at fixing it. And along that same vein, the Turbo 350 shares a lot of parts with the 700R4, which became the 4L60, 4L65, and somewhat the 4L70. So they're all family, if you know what I mean. So let's move these out of the way and talk about what I think is the biggest holdback as far as power absorption anyway, or handling it. This is the low reverse roller clutch support. It freewheels and locks. Freewheels clockwise as you're looking down from the pump area. It locks counterclockwise. Very similar to what we call the center support in the Turbo 400. It's lugged into the case, but in the Turbo 400, it has a bolt also holding it, as well as the lugs in the case. It's bolted. So in a Turbo 350, they went a different direction. This has one big lug, so it locates it into the case. And I hope you can see, this is called the anti-clunk spring. This sets in the case and basically is there to absorb this wanting to rock in the case. And of course, over time, I'm not sure what they were thinking here, the direction that this locks, over time, this is still in good shape because it's made out of steel. The aluminum case is worn to the point where this will cock. This is no different. I was at least 1/8 of an inch cocked. There's no way to get this out without having to drive it back with a hammer and a screwdriver or something to get it back so the lugs line up in the case. Four-wheel drives, especially plowing snow, that's where I first noticed it working at the tranny shop, and this is when these were still relevant, still being put in vehicles, that they'd blow the back of the case apart. Yes, they were also weak in the bell housing area. The HD case, as we know it, originated with the TH350s with the giant cast iron 203 transfer case hanging off the back. They would break the bell housing right around here where it's thin because there's too much weight hanging on it. So they came up with the case with the 3 big bolts on either side, the big aluminum dust cover. There was rods coming down from the motor mounts and from this bolt hole back to the side of the transfer case on the side of the drive shaft was a long rod. And they did the same thing with the Turbo 400 HD case. But that does not affect what this is doing to the case internally, and I think when you put too much power to these combined with some wear, this just accelerates around like a saw blade and cuts that case in half. That's why you find them upside down. Of course, the bell house is going to break too because it's a weak spot. And that is the cause of the really catastrophic failures. You look them up, you'll find them. So it's something to be aware of anyway. And again, this case, in my opinion, is junk because I had to hammer. If I can get this in and out without it being cocked, then I'll go ahead and use the case. They do make, believe it or not, they call it a case saver for different reasons than a Turbo 400, but they make a piece that looks like the state of Texas, a solid piece. You replace the spring, if you can see that, with a solid metal piece, so this can, you know, in theory not move, but you've also now put all the stress on this where it's hitting the case. So I'm not sure you improved anything with the one-piece design. There's also a 4-piece design. I don't know. Like I say, I personally would not put this transmission back together because it was cocked beyond repair. So, and it's broken minorly. You might cut these off anyway, but All the parts in the Turbo 350 are physically smaller. Output shaft, no different. This is one I need to harvest to put in there. Very common. This one's no different. I guess when things start moving around, this rebuild is supposedly not that old. You find the bushing wore out here. I'm hoping the rest of the shaft is usable. I gotta look it over. This was a 6-inch output shaft, and it's cut off 1 inch because one of my other complaints about the Turbo 350s, and you got to give them credit on this one, in the early 80s, when I was working at the transmission shops, the aftermarket people and GM, the dealerships couldn't even keep the 700 R4s working for any length of time. There was a lot of revisions in 82, 83, 84, 85. And in the aftermarket, keeping up with all the technical service bulletin stuff, well, you're typically a year or so behind anyway. So nowadays with the internet, maybe it would be faster if this situation was to occur again, which let's not even get into that, whether it is occurring or not in the modern transmissions. But in this case, the only fix was to go to your core pile, build a Turbo 350 and convert, most of the time it was trucks, some cars too, back to TH350 non-lockup. So gone was your advantage of overdrive and lockup in the 700 R4, but it's no advantage if it doesn't work. So in order to prevent having to move the mount, the cross member, and shorten and lengthen the drive shafts on a 4-wheel drive, they came out with these nifty kits that had an aluminum spacer behind the Turbo 350 because the 700 R4 is physically longer. And that's how this one was. It was a surprise to the owner. When he showed me the adapter, I told him exactly what it was, and he thought his truck was an original TH350 truck. To which I told him that back in the day, we would even change the Pernurndl, park reverse neutral drive 2.1, would just change that over, try to make the truck look as stock as possible. But the telltale sign is on the back of the TH350 is an aluminum spacer about that long with some studs, and that's where the 700 R4 transfer case adapter would bolt on, and then everything else would be back where it belongs, and it would spend the rest of its life probably with a TH350. So they had two lives. They were worn out in the cars they were in, or at least here in the Northeast. The bodies rusted out first probably, so the transmissions were still rebuildable, and then they had a whole nother life after that. And everybody I know that fixes transmissions will tell you it typically takes at least 2 cores or 2 transmissions to build one working unit these days, because they're just wore out. So this one's no different. This particular one, it leaked out the front pump. It has a ton of silicone and bolts are too tight, and it's a comedy of errors, and but it was allegedly a working transmission. Either way, I'm just harvesting the shaft, hoping to be able to use this in the other transmission. Here's a look at the Gearstar TH350 ATI Super Case. It was fresh out of the crate when the gentleman realized the output shaft was not the right length. Well, I'm off to make something out of my Sunday. I don't see myself returning to this till later tonight, definitely tomorrow. So have a great afternoon wherever you are. I hope you're enjoying yourself, and take care.